fingertips above the water. You watched me drown. You could have saved me, but you let me down, yeah.
There's a lot of material out there you've done, as we talked off camera. You've done so many interviews. You've done so many, the CNN award. You've certainly been recognized for the work that you do. But I recently was in San Francisco, went out for a baseball game in Oakland, actually, with my son, and I was literally amazed at how big the homeless population is there. And you see stories in Los Angeles, how big it is as well, too. From the time you started in 92 in Pittsburgh doing this work to now, has the population continued to grow in Pittsburgh in kind of in the same fashion as other big cities?
We've tracked along with the national growth of homelessness, but we actually have made in the 2000s we made a dent. We were actually decreasing overall homeless, and it's going back up, but not the explosion you've seen out west or in some other places.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm assuming probably that's driven by cost of living, maybe in those areas.
Yeah, a lot of it, I think, behind the thing behind the thing is the cost of living.
Okay.
The housing and everything is whatever other factors involved. People with trauma histories, people with mental illness, people going through periods of depression, addiction, or whatever. Behind that all is how affordable is life in that area. Mm-hmm. And that's why, out west, a lot of my colleagues that do this work, social workers and such, they're actually pretty close to homeless themselves with the housing costs. So,
okay.
You can imagine how things are.
Speaking in the broader sense of homelessness, because you certainly have had decades of work there, so I'm sure you formed an opinion. I think the average person thinks of a homeless person in a certain way, usually someone panhandling when they drive past an intersection or something. Can you speak a little bit about some of the causes that create homelessness, things that happen in people's lives that may not be readily apparent to the average person?
Well, as a teacher, I think of myself as a teacher in medicine. That's kind of where I got started, was to find a classroom that was real different than the version that we have in a hospital or a clinic where we're wearing the white lab coat and we're in charge.
Right.
I think every person has a story. And so story is really important. And being open to that story. A lot of times we put people in boxes really quickly, and we see them as a checklist of symptoms or labs we have to order or whatever. So what I've learned is that everybody's story is pretty unique, but the themes that come out tend to be a tremendous amount of childhood disruption, almost the opposite of my childhood, really, where there's abuse, there's maybe generational poverty, things like that.
Okay.
And so most of the people that I've seen on the street don't come into the world or grow up with a lot of sense that they're going to do a whole lot better than a certain amount.
Okay.
So I think that already is a knock against them. Then there's a lot of abuse, rape, a lot of molestation out there, way more than you'd think.
Okay.
And also another contributor that I didn't appreciate for a decade or so was the amount that gender issues have fallen into people being homeless. They say about 40% of the youth homeless in some areas are, not traditionally gendered. I'm not sure what the right way to say that is.
Right.
But there's a lot of conflict with family, with self, whatever society, and then they end up out on the street. Addictions, well, mental health issues are a big thing too. I think the stats are like 30% of the people that are homeless have major mental health problems.
Okay.
Like depression, major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or something like that.
Okay.
A lot of the folks you see look, quote, normal, and they can function, you know, in the setting that they're in. But if you get to know them, you realize, wow, this person really has significant mental health needs.
And there's, I'm guessing, a considerable amount of our vets out there as well, too?
Yeah. Now, when I first started, there were a fair number of Vietnam vets.
Okay.
I don't think we saw the same flooding of the streets with vets from Afghanistan and that whole campaign over there. The thing that I know from family and others is the rate of suicide of that group. I think that's a bigger issue with the current vets, is the suicide rates are just out of this world. But the VA and groups like ours and others, I think, have learned a little bit from the Vietnam period and really at least created pathways for the homeless vets to reduce that or almost eliminate it. So,
okay, well, there's a positive.
Yeah, it is.
Let's talk a little bit about your in '92
Yeah.
when this, or I guess it would have been maybe even 90, 91 when it really kind of started for you. What led you to this kind of work? What led you to basically outreach and become a champion of the homeless, especially from a medical standpoint?
Yeah, I've had that question hundreds and hundreds of times, and I'm not good at it yet.
Okay. Okay.
Sometimes I'm real blunt, and I just say, I realized that doctors were assholes, and we needed to get out of ourselves somehow. As a teacher, and I didn't want to be that person that couldn't connect with human beings. There was a patient I had that precipitated my interest in people in the street who left the hospital. I barely got to know him, but I couldn't convince him to stay. And it was winter, like now, and he left and he froze to death. And so that really tugged at my heart. I'd been working in the area of domestic violence just before this. And I've been teaching under the Pittsburgh Mercy system. At that time, they had Mercy Hospital. And so I was teaching medical residents and students. And I began to see the numbers of people suffering domestic violence that were within the patient population there. And the more I looked, the more I saw. It was kind of like discovering dark matter. You know, it was everywhere.
Right.
But no one was aware of it.
Got it.
And then as you began to think about it and observe it more closely, you realize that, a huge number of people that want Valium are being abused. A huge number of people that don't show up for their appointments are being abused. A huge number of people that we're running CAT scans over and over on are being abused.
So the underlying
the underlying issue was domestic violence.
Okay.
And we were just running through these same ineffective ways of looking at people because we either didn't see what was going on with them, but more importantly, we didn't even know how to ask or be open to what a person's going through.
Okay.
So the openness to the human being in front of me or us really bugged me that we weren't invested in that. And even if people were inclined to care and take the time, and people in health systems are rushed and pushed, and so there's a lot of structural violence that they experience that dehumanizes the health workers, and then they just become part of this machine.
Right.
But even if they really wanted to take the time, it was difficult to set the table for that. Trust, how to listen. And with domestic violence victims, the more I began to ask them, I realized that people were not ready for someone to actually open up that door. And so it took a lot of effort on my part to learn how to kind of start fresh with people in terms of all the areas of their health that they're willing to talk about were okay to have as part of the care plan. So that really got me interested. It was like this discovering that people have their own reality. And so the notion that there was a gap in the reality of people and the health system just got more and more interesting to me.
Okay.
And I could see it in so many different ways.
Okay.
So that reality gap, and I hope I'm not going down the rabbit hole too far here, but
we have all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That reality gap pissed me off because people were not getting care. But then as you saw collectively, my peers and others, when people didn't move along nicely or fit into our boxes, rather than saying, wow, we should improve our health system, the default mode tended to be, why can't they just cooperate? Why do they go back? They must enjoy being beaten because we've tried to work with them and they go back.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
Or why do they use drugs? Or why are they whatever? And it is a very self-referential way of looking at the world to say, why can't they fit our boxes? And if they don't, they're not. I don't know how.
Jim, was the system doing that to the physicians and the nurses and the clinical psychiatrists?
It's not conscious
at that time,
for the most part.
Okay,
but it was before, and it continues now.
Okay,
they call it the hidden curriculum in.
Okay.
The cops and others, they have the same thing. They're thrown into a situation where they have certain tools, and society's way more complicated than that. And they keep trying to use the same tools, and things don't work out too well, and they get people angry at them and resentful, and so they just tend to close ranks and say those people are the problem. And then once you get an attitude like that, then the people that are suffering see that, and then they give you an attitude back, and then pretty soon you're saying, see, that's the way they are.
Right.
And then you're giving the attitude back.
Right.
And it happens in emergency rooms and hospitals and clinics. And I think we try to be professionals in all of our areas, but again, the health system has really become a big business for the most part. And a lot of humanity is lost. And it's a time when people are scared and vulnerable. So I think anybody out there who's been a patient or has tried to help a family member navigate the system realizes that there are good people out there in the health system, but you can feel like just a number or not like a human being.
I can't speak to having a family member with a homeless circumstance we're helping with, but I can speak to the frustration of having family members with mental illness and going through just as being the family and the supportive structure for them, and then trying to interface, getting the help and so forth. It's been extremely difficult. I can, on a personal level, can absolutely understand that.
Well, my first thinking had nothing to do with homelessness. It was all about, gosh, we're kind of jerks. We don't listen to people. And it's not only that people don't feel heard, but we weren't getting the information we needed to make the diagnosis.
Okay. Because you weren't digging down and getting and really caring enough or taking the time to care enough to find out,
to let them tell their story.
Okay.
Even as a medical student, I remember there was a lady who had this diarrhea, and she'd had it for years, and she'd gone from her husband is in the military. She'd gone from one city to another, these big medical systems, and they keep running a couple tests and giving her something. And nobody actually sat and listened to the whole story of how she started having diarrhea. And it turns out, and I was no genius as a medical student, turns out she had had an accident, and someone had removed a very particular part of her bowel. And after that, she'd had diarrhea. It's not rocket science.
Okay.
But no one ever put those two together. And she gave me some interesting stories about things that happened when the diarrhea got better. So I thought, wow, there must be malabsorption of the bile in that area. And so I went to the professor and I said, I think it might be this thing that happened. And he said, yeah, I think you're right. So they put her on this medicine. She wrote me a letter from wherever she was next and said, you'll be a great doctor. You finally found the diagnosis they all missed. And it was just because I listened to people. And then we had a kid at Children's Hospital who everyone was doing poking and doing studies on because they thought he had this exotic disease that they were excited about. And I had a little more time. I just watched the kid. He was in the playroom.
Okay.
And he was picking up the toy animals, and he was saying, "You're a piece of shit," and just mean things to the stuffed animals, and crayoning with a black crayon. And I said, "Well, are you okay at home? Is anyone hurting you?" And he says, "Yeah, my dad beats the crap out of me all the time." And so I went to the resident above me. I was a student. I said, "I don't think it's porphyria." And he said, "What do you think it is?" And I said, "I think it's he's being beaten up." And I remember the resident was angry at me. Like, "Well, who do you think you are?" And I think what he was, in retrospect, he was like, "I'm not comfortable with that. That's not medical. I don't know what to do with that." And he said, "Well, if that's what you think it is, you need to go talk to the father." So I had to, as a medical student, I had to screw up the courage to go to this father and say, "Are you beating up your kid?" And I did, fortunately. I had great parents in the medical field, so I had some sense of courage about what was right and wrong. And the dad broke down and cried and said, "Yeah, I have a terrible problem." And so that, no one was seeing this kid's symptoms in that light. And then I remember, even though the attending physician praised me, the resident above was even more angry at me because I guess I showed him up or something. But I got this sort of sense that there's boundaries, that we don't do that. We don't ask that kind of questions. We don't have time for that. And it's sad because, yeah, you have to do your medical technical stuff, but if you lose the human part of it, then you're kind of an idiot.
Do you think that's still going on, or was it just more prevalent maybe in the 80s and 90s? Have we changed at all as a medical community in terms of looking for abuse or looking for? Do you feel it at all?
I feel it's worse.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. It's worse.
Wow.
Now the students that we work with, that I work with, they love doing my street work. It's almost like you let them out of the barn because they get to talk to people in a real way.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, I remember a student a couple years ago said, after the month with me, she said, "Dr. Withers, I got my common sense back."
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's sad, but that's good.
Uh-huh.
And I don't want to craft the health system as like some evil empire, but we are, driven by,
profit, right?
Profit, and an overwhelmingly complicated society, and the needs and the size of our system, and it's difficult. It's really difficult to slow everything down and just be present to a person. My dad was a country doctor, and I made house calls with him. And I remember going into these rural houses, and it was a totally different environment. Seemed like a luxury now, but
yeah. That had to be part of the foundation, I would imagine, for you to do this work.
Yeah, I think it definitely created a concept in my mind of how important it is to see the context of somebody. When I was a teenager, our family did medical trips, and so we worked in Nicaragua, we worked in Guatemala, we worked in St. Lucia, and those are really exciting, going to these places, especially in the 70s.
Right.
And just marveling at my mom and dad. My mom was a nurse, just rolling their sleeves up and doing this stuff, and I kind of thought, oh, it's a normal childhood. But it was really quite special. That's what I said earlier.
Sure.
I was really blessed with caring parents that modeled going where other people were and helping them, whether it was in a house call or another part of the world. It just seemed like the right thing to do, to go help people. And so I had a really strong sense of that. So almost like I consider it my original vaccination series against cynicism. And but I needed a few booster shots along the way.
I like that.
Not to lose my my sense of what a healthcare person could be.
Was your undergraduate, is it Haverford? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah. And you your medical training was at Pitt,
right?
In 84. So the period from 84 to 92 92-ish, because I believe you actually did Operation Safety Net formally start in 92. Is that correct?
It actually formally started in January of 93.
Okay.
I was kind of under the radar before that.
Okay.
Sneaking out.
So when you went into residency, when you were finished with Pitt and you started your practice, the journey, when you talk about the cynicism or the other, maybe not philosophy, but the other attitudes that you saw in the medical profession, did you feel that your other students graduating with you were just not seeing things the same way as you? Did you always feel that your outlook toward medicine was different from the moment that you graduated Pitt?
Maybe a little different. I think most of the people, especially nurses, God bless them, the social workers, but even amongst the medical students, I think most of them had a fundamental sense of wanting to help humanity, and be there for people. It gets real confusing then when you get thrown into the technical side of it, and then you get people around you increasingly jaded as you get into the hospitals and things like that.
Okay.
And we don't generally in health education have people that say, look at yourself in the mirror and see what's going on with how you feel about humanity, yourself.
Okay.
We don't check in like that. It's just like kind of like the old, suck it up and do it.
Okay.
And there's a certain pride in that. I can work for 36 hours without sleeping or whatever that we used to do. And you buy into it. It's kind of like the military or lots of other arenas where you get a sense of pride in your toughness, your expertise.
Mm-hmm.
But then you end up trying to be the Wizard of Oz, and it just doesn't.
So eventually it's a crash and
it
burn
is.
somewhere.
You get trapped
right?
in your own lab coat.
Okay.
And then people don't know how to navigate out of that box to just be a person again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They get kind of scared. I have to have all the answers. And then as the business side of things has grown across the country, I think a lot of physicians feel they're just more and more part of a giant machine. That's the specialness that made them go through 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 3 or 4 years of residency. Nowadays, $400,000 of debt.
Uh-huh.
It just it may not be worth it to be just a part of someone else's machine.
The stress factor on new physicians because of that debt typically. That has to also feed into the amount of hours worked, the amount of patients, patients seen, scheduling, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which
they start their careers from a place of fear, and it's never a good place to make decisions or to, So they may say, I've got to make big bucks, or I'll never get out from under this, and they may just focus on their own survival at that point. And I think, it's still possible to say, I want to create innovative things to serve the underserved or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a luxury when your back's against the wall like that.
I would think so. In your TED Talk, you came right out of the gate pretty bold there. And one of the things was you shared the story about I think it might have been your homeless patient who refused treatment, went out in the cold and passed away. And then the way that patient was referred to by other physicians.
Right.
And was that was a key moment at that time that you were going to go in the direction of being their advocate. Is that right?
Yeah. I think it was around, I'd really sunk my teeth into the domestic violence world. I worked with the Women's Center.
Right.
I created a consult service for domestic violence, and it was just like opened up a whole new world for me where I could see a little bit of what it looked like from the victim's point of view.
Okay.
Like, wow, this health system is confusing and everything. And so I was groping for some other classroom where we could sort of make a house call to people that were living in a different version of reality.
Right.
I tried making that work with domestic violence in a hospital, but it's just too busy, too hectic to really teach
Okay.
those principles. Some people would get it, and it was wonderful to see people sort of light up and say, oh my gosh, this is really
Right.
a justice issue almost. It's really important. But most people were like, okay, Dr. Withers, whatever. I got to get these charts done.
Got it.
And I could feel for them. So I wanted to have, as a teacher, I wanted to have a classroom that got them out of the stress of that
Mm-hmm.
and let them sort of just take a breath and be a person and observe the humans that they were trying to treat. So initially I thought that had to be done overseas. So I went to Belize,
Mm-hmm.
and I was interested in international healthcare again. But first of all, I had to take my vacation time, so that was limited. And secondly, I had this growing sense that I didn't want to run off to some other part of the world. I wanted to stay in Pittsburgh, and I really wanted to force myself to look in the mirror, but also force the health system, if I could,
Mm-hmm.
to say, no, look at the people right in front of you that you're not seeing. And so that's when that patient left and froze, and the comments about him
Mm-hmm.
being a bumsicle kind of really hit me. And it was almost like, okay, then. That's a great opportunity to maybe get to know the people that we're judging
Mm-hmm.
that are sleeping under bridges and such.
Your medical contemporaries, have you gotten any kind of pushback on that? Have you? I mean, we all have different personalities. I get it. You know, you take 100 people, 100 physicians, they're going to have 100 different personalities. I get that. Hate to lump people in there, but that was pretty bold statement you made there.
What did I say?
Oh no! When you talked about another physician, and people were referring to him as a bumsicle.
Oh yeah.
And you know that's shop talk, obviously. For I'm assuming for a hospital or for physicians. I'm not revealing any great secrets that every profession has their own dark side, Absolutely.
Dark humor, whatever they like
Mm-hmm.
to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And usually that's partly at least a sign that the people that are using that kind of language are confused and frustrated and
burned out, maybe,
and just they're just trying to lighten it up for themselves somehow.
Got it.
If you read that book House of God a long time ago, it was kind of like that whole book was about that underbelly, MASH,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, personally, it was a very interesting time. I had these ideas about medical education, having a new classroom,
Right.
and how we could maybe change perceptions and the way relationships were made with patients. But as a human being, I was just disgusted with being a doctor at that point. And I'm not sure I fully understand why I was as angry as I was.
Okay.
Maybe it was just, at that point, quite a few years of just being told to, kind of indirectly told to shut up and,
Fall in line.
And I literally got to the point where I didn't know if I wanted to keep going as a doctor, if I had to only
Mm-hmm.
do it that way. But I saw it as my responsibility to change that. I wasn't going to wait for the system to change because it's a big, complicated system.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, I can do something. I'm gonna try to get to know people that are sleeping outside.
So you did that by posing as a homeless person. Is that correct?
Yeah. Very much like I had done with domestic violence.
Okay.
Because that was my template. I began to try to read about it. health care for homeless people, look more carefully at the patients that I had, talk to my peers, and then I had my only 1 month of sabbatical in my whole life. Happened right then, which was pretty awesome. And so I took it and I got a couple notebooks. And with one of the notebooks, I went around town looking at anybody that worked with the homeless and just interviewing them.
Okay.
I ran into a nurse, Marilyn Sullivan, who was with Healthcare of the Homeless, and she was a great help at taking me to different people. And then once I got that going, I got to see this whole other world of people like Dr. Hall, out in East Liberty, who was working with the poor, and Sister Liguori, who just passed, unfortunately, and Father Ryan out here in McKees Rocks, and hearing their stories of how they had started with nothing and created major services. It was like just reading all these great books of people, and it was encouraging. But everywhere I asked, I said, "Does anyone go under bridges? Does anyone do medical work?" And they were like, "No. We're overwhelmed here or wherever." And then I got people saying, "Well, they haven't hit bottom yet. You can't go help people that don't want to help themselves. It's a waste of time. You might be enabling them. In fact, they're probably really dangerous, and they'd sue you." And so, and this is not everybody, but there's people that were saying this to me, and it reminded me of the peanut gallery. Mm-hmm. I had heard about domestic violence, saying, "Oh, well, you can't help someone that doesn't want to help themselves. If she goes back and gets beaten, you can't stop that. They must enjoy it, whatever."
Excuses are easier.
Yeah, exactly. And not real intelligent, because you're not getting actually closer to the thing. You're pushing it away.
Right.
And so I didn't take it personally or whatever, but finally I ran into a formerly homeless guy at a meeting, and he said, "Well, there's some of us going out putting blankets on people." And I said, "Well, could I go out?" And this was Danny Robinson, and he said, "Nah, we don't like suits," And I was probably did have a tie on at that point. And I said, "Oh, but I said, "Oh, I'll introduce you to this one guy. He was Mike. He might take you out." So I went to another meeting, and he introduced me to Mike. And then so Mike is a character. I love Mike. Mike himself was doing his own outreach on the street for like 6 years before anybody that I knew of in Pittsburgh.
Right.
And but he was skeptical. He said, "Well, they don't like doctors." And I said, "I know. That's why I want to go out." And he said, "All right, I'll take you out on 2 conditions. First, don't dress like a doctor. Second, don't be an asshole." So I went to, I really wanted this to happen.
Sure.
And so I went to the library in my church, of all places, and there was this book, 52 Ways to Help the Homeless. And there was a chapter in there that said, "Consider dressing like a homeless person to get to know homeless people." I thought, okay. So it had a recipe for putting stuff in your hair and all this. So I'm in the backyard, and I'm putting this dirt on myself, and my 3 little boys at the time came out, and they said, "Daddy, what are you doing?" Probably looked like fun. And I said, "Well, I'm going to go visit people that live under bridges." And they said, "Why do they live under bridges?" I said, "I don't know, but can we come along?" Not this time.
Right.
And so I showed up, and Mike said, "Well, you got the look. Let's see if you can keep up." So I began going out with Mike, and we would go out till sometimes 2, 3 in the morning, and sometimes 3 times a week. And so I really almost got addicted to it in the beginning. It's kind of what people go through when they first started going into homeless camps. It's just such a different world that they almost get a little addicted to doing it.
Okay. Can you talk about at homeless camp? What did you encounter?
Well, I remember one that was down where the convention center is now.
Okay.
We used to call it Vaughnville because there was a guy named Vaughn who was the founder of it, if you will.
Okay.
I mean, I have this funny story of, you got to get a kick out of people. Okay, that's
Sure.
what I'm going to say. First of all,
Sure,
if you're
absolutely.
angry at homeless people, if you think they're the enemy, I don't know what to say. They're just humans, and yeah, they can be a pain sometimes when they're panhandling or having their issues, whatever. But once you get embedded into the community, things flip around, and you just see them as people, and you begin to fall in love with them, like the characters and their strengths, and sometimes their own self-defeating tendencies that they can't get out of for the time being. And again, to me, it's just like reading the most amazing stories. It's a kind of an incredible movie to be watching, and it's an honor to be able to have people share their lives with you.
Absolutely.
And so there was this is before my time, but I heard that Vaughn and his gang were on the north side and near the railroad tracks, and the railroad police, had enough of them, and they said, "You got to go, you got to get out of here." So I have this image of Vaughn leading his people across the bridge, probably with a bottle of vodka, like Moses, and he goes across, and at that time down up in the strip was kind of empty,
Right.
and they settled on the other side of the promised land, and set up their shacks, and Mike took me down there, and the first night I came in, he said, "Okay, now you stand here, and I'm going to go down, and I'm going to make sure it's okay, because George is a little crazy," and George became my good friend, but George was a little crazy.
Okay.
He's a Vietnam vet who was packing, and he was an interesting guy.
So it could be a little dicey down there. At
Could be
times.
dicey, yeah. And Mike was like this ninja kind of character that would, he said, "Now don't. There's a tripwire. Don't and stuff like that." And I was like, "Ooh." So we
Was
got
there
back.
a tripwire?
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, people are scared. They're sleeping
Sure,
outside.
no, I get it.
Like
I
they
get it.
used to be allowed to sleep above the train station there before they fenced it, and some of the guys that were up there, they'd literally break bottles so that when you were walking towards them in the night, you couldn't do it quietly. They'd hear the crunching.
Got it.
And they could be safe. There was one guy downtown who some people might remember. He sat on a milk carton right in front of this business called the Sterling Light Company.
Okay.
And I said to him, his nickname was Fats. I said, "Fats, why are you sitting right here in this bright light?" He said, "Well, no one's going to mug me here. It's so bright." So I began to see these little patterns of people's survival strategies. You can imagine if you were thrown out there.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, I mean,
it's horrifying.
Right, and you'd have to make friends, but could you trust them? And especially if you're a woman, you'd probably have to make deals to be protected. So it was in those days, that area was even wilder because there was all the there was all the prostitution and the sex workers walking around.
That's what Liberty Avenue, just the name Liberty Avenue actually carried a connotation with it, right?
I used to give out condoms, and some of the women would go, "Yo, condom man." So I was condom man for a while. But,
It's quite the handle there, doctor.
It was just like, but you'd go home at night and you'd say, "Did I just see all that?"
Yeah, I bet.
And then you'd see people curled up next to dumpsters, people with maggots in their legs, people who were, runaways, people with mental illness in their 70s or 80s. And it was almost like I wished I didn't know this now. Like, what are you going to do with all that? But,
as a physician, though, you have to be wired a certain way to be able to ingest a lot of human pain and so forth.
You do, although I think it's not part of standard training. It's honestly, there's different kinds of people.
Okay.
There's people that want everything tidy. They only want to work with the left kidney, and and they're good at it. And then there's kind of cowboys, and I think I'm in that category, who most of them work in ERs, or they do Doctors Without Borders for a while. I was a mountaineering instructor. I mean, it was just I love traveling. There's just kind of a different
I'm
group.
asking about that. There was wilderness medicine was part of your interest, and I didn't exactly know what that was.
Well, first of all, I love climbing, ice climbing, mountaineering and stuff, and then to combine it with medicine is even cooler. So in the early days, all my conferences I went to involved building snow caves and stuff.
Okay.
It was great.
Okay.
So I got ironically comfortable carrying medicines in a backpack, which came in handy.
Got it.
When I started doing this.
Got it.
Sort of a cosmically amazing thing that all came together. But so I think my own story kind of was coming together in this period, and I just couldn't stop going out. The first night at Vaughnville, the Shacks.
Were you getting any sleep?
Not enough.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
But that was kind of typical for a doctor in those days.
Okay.
I get more sleep now, but at least I was just completely fascinated with what I was seeing.
Okay.
It was a little weird because it was at day he's a doctor in the hospital with a lab coat. At night he's under the bridges.
There's a Marvel licensing agreement in there somewhere.
Yeah. And well, the tension was beginning to build because at first I was just going out and Mike was taking me around and I was meeting people.
Okay.
But very quickly I said, "Oh my God, you've got to go to the hospital." "Hell no, I'd rather die." "Can we take you there?" "No." "Do you have a doctor?" Fuck doctors,
Right.
And I was like, okay, I guess I got to do something. So I began realizing I have to start practicing medicine. And
so that made the change because you were pretty much just meeting and exploring, right?
And thinking in terms of education.
Okay, got it.
But I had to put that on the back burner.
Got it.
For that guy's wound, or that person's blood pressure, which was 220 over 140.
Right. Right.
Or this pregnant woman. And so I began sort of stretching myself to the very limit and saying, at least if I do something, it'll be better than nothing.
Got it. Yep.
And so it was almost like a war zone or a third world experience again. And that's not what most people would be comfortable with. But I got better at it, I felt. And then there was this nurse that started following around the hospital, Carol.
Okay.
And she said, "I know what you're doing." And I said, "Well, okay, don't tell anybody." And she says, "You're going to have to take me out with you." And I said, finally, okay. And she was a wound care nurse. What could be better?
Right.
And then suddenly I had another person to work with, and it revolutionized everything for me. And as a woman, she had this way of connecting with not just the women, but the guys.
Sure.
And then we put her with her own formerly homeless partner and pursued another nurse. And it didn't take long before we were kind of like beat cops doing different parts of the city.
Okay.
But at that point, we were practicing medicine, and I was developing a kind of my own rogue health system. So we had to keep records. And then I had to call my malpractice carrier at that point.
I would think.
And fortunately, I just said, "I'm doing this stuff." And they said, "Are you keeping records?" I said, "Yeah." "They're interesting, but they're complete." "Are you practicing within the scope of your training?" "Yeah, absolutely."
Mm-hmm.
They said, "Well, that sounds like great work. You might as well be indoors for all we care. Good luck." And then I had to tell my bosses at the hospital.
How'd that go?
Interesting again. I went for some reason to Dr. Luparella. He was the old grand professor. Everybody was scared of him. But
Just that name. How could you not be?
Well, he put Mercy on the map, and he was one of the
Right.
three smartest doctors in city.
Okay.
For sure, and terrifying. But I had been a chief resident with him, and he had some respect for me. So I went to him and told him what I was doing, and he goes, because he had trained all my bosses.
Okay.
And he said,
Okay.
"Well, don't tell your boss, and don't tell his boss. You want to make an appointment with Sister Joanne Marie. Just go straight to the CEO." And I thought, well, that's weird, but okay. So I made that appointment, and I showed up, and she listened to me, and she finally said, "Do you know how this hospital started?" I said, no. I said, well, this is the first Mercy hospital in the whole world. And it was started by 7 nuns that came over from Ireland. And they were called the Walking Sisters because they walked the streets of Pittsburgh. And so what you're doing fits our mission. And if anyone gives you trouble, you let me know.
Okay.
So it was like, thank you, Dr. Luparella.
You got special dispensation there.
Yeah. I started from the top and worked down.
No doubt.
So, yeah, and the sisters have been really supportive over the years. So when I started the program, I decided not to start my own nonprofit, but to put it under them.
Okay. And that obviously probably was a little easier getting equipment and so forth, right? I mean, because the hospital
we stole stuff, but yeah. But then we
That's great.
Then we started getting funds.
That's great.
But
That's great.
You know, Mercy has been supportive over the years. Actually, probably more now than they were in the beginning.
Okay.
In the beginning, it was sort of we got a grant, Care for the Poor, allowed me to hire Mike and another guy and a part-time secretary. But then Pittsburgh heard about what we're doing, and so many people were generous. They started helping us, so we were able to buy supplies and things like that.
Right.
And Pittsburgh has continued to be really generous to us.
Homeless today in Pittsburgh, are there still these little cities, these little micro cities, or is it more spread out now?
They're more spread out. I saw this, I've traveled all over the world.
Right.
It's been my sort of obsession is to make this a field of medicine. And when I was in New York years ago, I began seeing people putting up fences. They'd drive the homeless people out of a certain area and put up fences, and it was almost like a military campaign.
Right.
Down here in Pittsburgh at that time, they were just kind of chasing them out. They'd go somewhere else. They'd chase them out of there. They'd go back, and then they go to the original place.
Right.
So it was kind of this game.
It's a game, yeah.
And the police officers I talked to were frustrated because they said, it's not illegal, to be homeless. It's just, we're just being told to get them out of there. So they started doing that here. And
Okay.
I don't know what the back room was, but they must have heard about it, and they've done that here. And so the big camps that were unsightly, they're largely not in sight anymore.
Okay.
So we have incredible outreach staff and other agencies that work with us. We collaborate, so we know where the remaining camps still are, and they tend to be up the hill in the woods, or at the edges of town or something like that. But they're still out there.
When you first started, obviously we talked about it being dicey at times. Is there still a safety concern, or is there still directives given to your group on how to stay safe there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important. It weighs on me, especially since we have students involved so much. But there are pretty good protocols for how to do outreach. And so there's always an outreach worker who's sort of the lead on the group. Usually they've had homeless experience themselves.
Okay.
And they know the people in the streets really well. And so if there's a camp that's not safe, we avoid it.
Okay.
Or might have just a certain team that knows them really well to go in. Okay. And we keep track all the time on it's like a soap opera. You got to keep up with all the characters and everything. So that's really important on a weekly basis. But we always announce we're coming in, and like in the days when there were a lot of alleys, Mike would go down and say, "Hey, what's up?" Someone was doing a deal. and then we'd say, "Okay, we'll come back," and or
Probably
whatever,
a good idea.
or whatever, and so you got to be sort of in balance with it and careful. I found early on that if you're just really respectful to people, you don't try to lord over them in any way. It's amazing how nice almost everybody on the street can be. And if you sense danger, you just get away from it. Fortunately, at this point, of all the hundreds of street medicine programs I know about, none have ever had anyone hurt by a homeless person.
Wow.
And I'm talking 30 years or
How
so.
about that?
No one doing street medicine has ever been sued. So those two statistics are kind of bizarre.
They are bizarre.
Someone should have been hurt. Knock on wood.
Just the odds. Yeah, the odds of it. Right.
And someone should have been sued by now.
And the odds of that too.
So it speaks somehow to the relationship that we're able to have with people. It's kind of amazing how different our relationship is than our colleagues are able to have in the ERs or the paramedics or the others. They usually kind of get the brunt of people's anger.
Right.
And we don't. We get hugs and stuff.
And it has to come down to approach, right? It has to. It has to start with approach.
Yeah.
And that's obviously you've refined that over time. I mean, from the very first time you went in there.
Yep. Right. Continue to try not to be an asshole.
Yeah. Basically, it seems like an easy premise, right?
Yeah.
But the work itself. You talked a little bit about your love of travel, and what is the street medicine symposia that you did? Let's talk about that a little bit.
All right, so I'll kind of try to be a little
your show, my friend. Take
streamlined.
Your time. That's okay. We have time.
So in the early days, I was. It sounds dramatic, but I was willing to give my life for this. I was really, really committed, and yet I felt alone. I didn't know anybody else doing this work. In retrospect, there were a few people in the world doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Jim O'Connell was doing the work up in Boston. There were some nurses in Toronto that were doing it already. Dr. Greer in Miami was doing street work, and then the first I learned about was a guy in Calcutta.
Dr. Prager?
Prager, yeah. You've done your reading.
Yes, sir.
So I happened to be in India in '93 December, and someone said, "Hey, there's a guy that does what you do up in Calcutta." So I made my way up there, and I got to meet Jack, and it was for me an epiphany, because here was somebody and a group of people who were doing what I was doing, and all the stuff that I've been thinking about, they had addressed in some way. And even though it looked different than Pittsburgh, the underlying structure of what they were doing was very similar.
Okay.
And it was super exciting. And I think it was at that point I decided, this is a field of medicine. It doesn't have a name yet, but I think every city that has people in the street should have one. So that really galvanized the rest of my life. And so I began traveling, and people increasingly started coming to Pittsburgh to learn what we did. And I just sort of shared whatever knowledge I had, and I gave more talks and traveled more. And pretty soon the thing snowballed.
Mm-hmm.
And in around the early 2000s, I got an opportunity from a funder to, quote, spread my model. And I said, well, it's not McDonald's, there are standards and all, but most of the people that do this don't have any money.
Mm-hmm. No,
so it's not like I can,
right,
make a living off of consulting. And it's more of a grassroots movement, and every city's different.
Okay.
So I said, can I just bring them together? And they said, sure. So then it was here in Pittsburgh, and I had to give it a name. So I said, well, how about street medicine?
Mm-hmm.
And so we had the first International Street Medicine Symposium in Pittsburgh in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was like there was only 17 people that came from outside, but they were all like Babe Ruth and Roberto Clemente. I mean, they were all superstars in my mind. And it was kind of historical in my view. But nobody noticed it. It was just amazing, though. And Dr. Prager came from Calcutta.
Wow.
And so they all decided, well, we want to do this again. And so that continued to happen. And as the movement grew, we got to the point where I felt we needed to start a new nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2009, we started the Street Medicine Institute,
Okay.
which is a separate organization.
Okay.
And its purpose is to help any city or community that wants to start street medicine to do it. Still, a lot of that's me, but a lot of that's some other experts, and increasingly, written materials and trips there and such. And then the symposium has continued to get bigger and bigger. This year is in Toronto.
Okay.
We usually get around 500 people from 6 continents.
Wow.
And so many students are involved now. So it has come a really long way since I put dirt in my hair. But and so
Sure sounds like it.
part of that, I think, is that it's a right thing to do, and then everybody recognizes that in their own cities. And
Because the need's there, right?
The need's there, and I think everyone looks and says something ought to be done. And then just to give them sort of a template for where to start, it's like seeding a cloud, and it just goes. And I'm talking northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria and South Africa and Brazil and India and St. Petersburg and all these places that seem really different, but when you meet the people that do this work, they have the same spirit. And they really love having a global community that they can be part of, because a lot of them feel kind of homeless in their own cities.
Okay.
Like, why do you take care of these people on the street? That
Right,
kind of
right.
attitude.
Right.
So when we get together, it's like, yeah, we get it.
Yeah, they're amongst their own.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is that camaraderie is probably essential for their psyche, I would think, too.
Yeah, and we're having more fun.
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
How does homelessness look different in different countries from America? Is we think of homelessness, we think of America. Other countries are struggling with it too.
Yeah, and I mean, again, similarities and differences. There's the similarity there's always some group of people, and it's a heterogeneous group usually that end up on the streets.
Okay.
And they all have trauma histories, and they all have addictions and mental illnesses and traumatic brain injury, and they're usually represented minority groups that were native or oppressed. A lot of times they're people from rural areas that came to cities, be that Bangkok or Anchorage or wherever, and they can't make it in the city, so they don't fit in. And they're other. In other words, they've been otherized.
Got it.
But developing nations, third world or whatever you want to call them, they tend to have a lot more kids, a lot more street kids, a lot more families. And sometimes it's hard to say when homelessness begins, because it's sort of like, well, that housing isn't too good. Whoa, those are just shacks. Oh, those are lean-tos. Oh, those are sort of abandoned
structures,
culverts or whatever.
Okay. So what qualifies as homeless?
Exactly. All the way down to, nothing. And so there's less of a clear distinction that we still sort of have here in the States. We might get more third worldish if the economy gets worse, but and so and there's always people that care and try to do stuff. So that's kind of the third world arena, and there's giant slums, and they have their own health needs.
Right.
But then in Northern Europe particularly, there are a lot more social systems that really address it. Okay. So they do have homeless, and they tend to be refugees from Eastern Europe and wherever. But they're really coordinated and aggressive about making services for people. So their homeless numbers are pretty small.
Okay.
So 2 years ago, we had our conference in Rotterdam, and it was highlighting the fact that they really had a handle on things, and all kinds of innovative housing, social services, and government working together. And not all of Europe's like that. Great Britain has some big problems, and so do some of the other areas. But states are a moving target too. I think when I was a youngster, Actually, there really wasn't much homeless where I grew up, but in the 80s, let's say. It just kind of came on the scene. And I think we kind of just thought, oh, they're bums, they're lazy, they're drug addicts. And all those things which I think of as diseases of despair are still a factor, a big factor. But as we move towards more and more people not quite being able to make it, I think we're shifting towards a point maybe in the future where we just have to say, gosh, there's a lot of poor people.
Got it. Yeah, no, I get it. And that's what I wanted to also ask you. So you've done this work for so long. Do you have any ideas on what we can do as a federal government to solve this problem, or do you really think it needs to be handled locally?
Well, I mean, it has to be at both levels. The part I understand is the local.
Sure.
I get kind of confused and overwhelmed with governments solving problems. But then again, I recognize they have to be partners. They can't like be drilling holes in the boat while you're bailing.
Right.
So I think government should listen more to what's working, and I think the Housing First movement is a good example of that. Housing First we were kind of doing that here in Pittsburgh before it had a name, but it came out of New York City, where they took 500 chronically street homeless people and put them in apartments straight, and provided lots of supports for them. And after 5 years, 80% of those hopeless cases were still in apartments.
80%.
80%.
Well, that's a success.
It was, and that's about the rate that a good team can do anywhere. 85% retention. It's not happily ever after when you get some of these people in an apartment. You have to really, depending on how far things have gotten or how big their needs are, you have to have really skilled teams to help them reintegrate. And to be honest, a lot of people never really, they don't become like me. You know, they still have a lot of trauma and issues and addictions.
Sure.
But that's a good example of where the government made money available for that process.
When you see how many homeless there are in LA right now, in downtown LA, and San Fran / Oakland, primarily San Fran, I think, compared to the two cities, it to the average person, it looks just so like, how in the world could we catch up now? Right. Did you ever get that feeling when you look at those circumstances, those unique circumstances? Are you overwhelmed by that? I am. And I used to think about, like, what if LA asked me, or what if New York asked me? And they have. But one of my buddies, he was actually the guy that started a street medicine program in Allentown. Okay. He's now the guy starting the program in L.A., Brett Feldman. Okay. With USC. I better get it right. Or UCLA.
No, it's USC, I think it is.
Yeah, they don't like to be confused.
USC. Anyway.
I hear anyways.
But he's developing a full-fledged street medicine program. I think in areas like that, from the medical point of view, it's like being in a war. You just pick off what you can, and don't panic. If you need to, maybe break down a city into sections. Right. That's why LA is so complicated, because they got that Skid Row. That's.
Have you ever been there?
Yeah.
Like recently?
Yeah.
Because I've just seen the video, like we all have, but it just appears to be absolutely incredible, the size of it. And I don't want to be publicly negative about it, but I do think it's kind of like it perpetuates itself. And there's a lot of good people doing a lot of service there, but it's kind of like they walled off so many people, and the complexity, it's almost like an abscess. I'm sorry. Got it. And so if I would be in charge of the world or whatever, I'd suggest that they
provide more services, but kind of break that up a little bit. Don't have it just all walled off. I don't even know if they can meet the needs of all the people that are there, but
so it's more difficult when the homeless are in one large area.
I think it perpetuates
okay.
a lot of
Okay.
problems. And I admit here, when the camps in Pittsburgh got big, I kind of wished someone would break them up, and they did. I mean, there was one on the north side that was under the 9th Street Bridge, and it was like 50, 60 people.
Okay.
And, we knew a lot of the people, but then once it gets to be that size, then these other people come in, they're predators,
Right.
drug addicts, and they were
Right.
telling us to get out,
Right.
and they were scary dudes. And so they get victimized by
Mm-hmm.
drug dealers
Mm-hmm.
and people that want to human traffic and all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just, I mean, I just don't think pushing misery into one corner has worked.
What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions about the homeless that we have in this country?
I think it's true of everybody in every situation. You're talking to some friend of yours that's having problems, and you project yourself onto that person.
Okay.
You say, well, I'd do this, I'd
Uh-huh.
do that. And I think it's the assumption that the person under the bridge is you, but lazy, or you, but chooses to use drugs,
Mm-hmm.
or you that doesn't want to get a job, or can't. And when you let that go and you kind of are open to what that person's real story is, then you realize, oh my God, they're doing pretty good just to stay alive. So I think, I don't know how to put that succinctly as a misconception, but I guess assuming it's easier than it is
Mm-hmm.
for the person that you're talking about, the levels of discouragement that they've gone through, the things they've been through, it's almost unbelievable when you begin to hear the stories, to the point where you sort of phase it out and you don't want to hear the story anymore because it's just that awful.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to make that an answer to your statement, but
I think I get it. I think I can tell you that looking at ourselves in a circumstance and saying, well, I would do this if I was in the circumstance to solve the problem,
Right.
without knowing the backstory
right,
of the individual. And then that comes down to just we're not listening enough.
right.
We're just not listening
And
enough.
there's a lot of I don't want to stigmatize people, but God bless them. A lot of people can't read. 40% of some populations have traumatic brain injury.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're doing really good just to get by.
Mm.
And that's messy. That's discouraging when you really look at how difficult solving problems for people are.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of don't want that to be true. You want it to be simpler.
Well, sure. On a lighter note, and you come across as being such an incredibly humble person. So when CNN informed you that you were going to be recognized as one of their heroes in 2015, can you talk a little bit about when did you hear about that? What it was like to go to that event?
I think I was contacted that they were gonna, they have features, people they feature,
Okay.
and I think it's a much greater number, and so that was how they came to Pittsburgh, and they wanted to go on the streets with me.
Right.
It was kind of awkward because I was having my hip replaced,
Oh my.
and I had my hip replaced, and then 3 weeks later I was on the streets. And I had to, because I couldn't just come back with cameras. I felt that was just not right.
Right.
So I had to hop around and the streets,
Oh, my.
and kind of tell people there's going to be cameras coming. I'm sorry, and they're like, that's all right, Doc. We love you, and so then 4 weeks after my surgery, they were here, and they did a great job. Nice people. The homeless themselves were so gracious to let people come in with their cameras and stuff. Right. And then I learned, there's actually a thing at the end where they pick, a certain number of people, and so that happened, and it was a great honor. I was kind of surprised at how many people knew about it, or thought that was a really important recognition. It is, but so I was a little embarrassed, but I went, and to sort of kind of, for me, to make more sense of it, I took my youngest niece with me, because I thought, well, I'll give her a treat. I'll take her along. And so it was like a Cinderella thing for her.
Sure. That's very cool.
Yeah, and the other people were really great that I met.
The TED Talk, which is where you came on my radar. How does that take place? Because I've had a couple of people on here that have done TED Talks, and the process has always been a little bit confusing to me. Yeah.
Now, Big Ted apparently is something that maybe Ted calls you himself. I don't know.
Is Ted a person?
No.
Maybe.
I think you got to be a much higher profile than I was. I did a Tedx talk. Mm-hmm. I did two of them, actually, but the people here that do the Tedx Pittsburgh are very cool. And I was really thrilled that they were interested in having me. So we went to a couple training sessions, like they'll orient you about
interesting. Okay,
what to do.
It's timed, right?
It is. I think it's 17 minutes. And
you went over a little bit, buddy.
Did I?
Just a couple seconds,
okay.
I think.
I didn't like. I never seen it. I've never seen the TED Talk.
Okay.
Because I didn't feel like it went very well. I memorized everything, and I've done a lot of talking, and my best talks are when I talk from the heart. Mm-hmm. You got to be prepared, but then you just it's probably like music. I mean, you learn your scales and you do all that stuff, and then but if it's coming directly from your heart, that's better. Absolutely. And I felt too scared and too I just memorized it all, so I didn't think it was a really good thing. And I got a terrible cramp in my foot. Halfway through,
nerves, or what was it?
No, it was pain. I felt like I almost wanted to cry. It hurt so bad.
Wow.
So I just kind of leaned on my right foot and hoped that the pain would go away.
Well, it didn't show.
Good.
It didn't show.
But it was a great opportunity, and it kind of makes you sort of have to package your experience in a different way.
Mm-hmm. That's been the recurring theme from Rocco Koza, from Darius Chisholm. People who've done them. You have this story to tell, and you've got this, it's 17 minutes, and you've got to somehow concisely start and finish and feel like you've got the bulk of it in there.
Now, I have had an incredible experience in all this work, especially the early years. I mean, there's a movie in my head that's incredible. Mm-hmm. And I could tell the story of me, or I could tell the story of people. I think what challenges me continually is, how do I transcend a story and pull lessons out of it? Like, what do I owe to try to say back to people about what I learned about being a human being? What I learned about exclusion that people have, what I learned about the courage of people who have changed their lives despite people spitting on them, Mm-hmm. And that's harder to pull out those lessons. Stories are fun and they're not that hard, but I'm still trying to figure out how to extract the juice.
Have you journaled through this process at all?
No, I hate journaling. I have written a book. I did that when I had my hip replaced. I took my buddy kidnapped me and took me to his cabin.
So you were sequestered away then?
I was sequestered. So I wrote solidly for 11 days, and it was a very weird experience because suddenly I was back in the early 90s, and it was weird. It was...
you find it cathartic?
I did. I found it scary because I realized, not that I deadened myself after all these years to all the stuff I've seen.
Okay.
But it came back, and I was thinking, I'm glad I'm not writing about like being raped or something, because I could smell the smells, I could feel the feelings, I could, and I've seen a lot of people die, I've seen a lot of people suffer, and I think over those times you kind of just put them in a bag somewhere or whatever. And
oh, you'd have to.
Yeah, and it came back, and that was tough.
I bet.
And I've rewritten it about 3 times or 4, so I'm preparing to rewrite it again because it needs to get better.
But you think it'll see the light of day?
It will. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This was excellent, my friend.
Well, thanks.
This was really, it means a lot to me that you came on this show. It means a lot to me.
Well, and that you care, and the people you're reaching care. I appreciate that.
Well, your work is absolutely incredible. Could I ask you to direct our audience to where they can help?
Sure. Locally, which we are, I would suggest Operation Safety Net. It's part of the Pittsburgh Mercy System. And I think if you just Google Operation Safety Net, it goes straight to a link there. Where,
it does. Mercy's site?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what I would suggest. If you're a person that thinks in a global world, that level, then the streetmedicine.org is that location as well.
Keep it up, my friend.
Thanks.
And please come back and see me. I want an update on that book. I'm fascinated.
All right, now I'm under the gun.
Thank you, doctor.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Fingertips above the water, you watch me drown. You could have saved me, but you let me down. Yeah.